Americans are not tuning out the news because they hate reality. They're tuning out because too much of modern news feels like a machine built to exhaust them. Every hour brings another alert, another argument, another headline, screaming for attention, while the simplest question goes unanswered: what actually matters to my life this week? And that is where this story begins. Because the most important story this week may not be the loudest one. It may be the one hiding underneath the noise in gas prices, interest rates, airport delays, and the quiet fear that Washington may once again turn a distant crisis into a domestic cost. Americans are not tuning out because they stopped caring about the country. In many ways, the opposite is true. Pew found that 80% of U.S. adults still say people have a responsibility to be informed when they vote. But that same research found a public that feels overwhelmed, skeptical, and increasingly selective. 52% say they are worn out by the amount of news. 48% say most of the news they run into is not relevant to their own lives. 60% say they have reduced how much news they take in, and 2/3 say they have stopped getting news from a specific source at some point. And that is the break in the relationship. People have not rejected the need to know. They have rejected a system that keeps demanding attention while offering too little clarity, too much outrage, too little usefulness, too many arguments that never end, and too few answers to the question that actually matters on a Tuesday morning. In America, what does this change for my family, my money, my plans, my week? Only 9% of Americans say they follow the news just because they enjoy it, and Gallup says trust in the mass media has fallen to 28%, a historic low. So the problem is not just overload, it is betrayal. The audience was told the news would help them understand the world. Too often it only leaves them drained, angry, and no better oriented than before. And that is why the next question matters more than ever. Which stories this week are actually worth your attention? The kind of news that makes people leave is not always the most important news. It is usually the most exhausting news. Endless political drama that never resolves. Headlines written like sirens. Arguments built to keep outrage alive for another hour, another panel, another scroll. The audience is pulled into conflict but rarely brought any closer to understanding. That is the trick. The story feels urgent but not useful, loud but not relevant, emotional but strangely weightless. And after enough of that, people do not just get tired. They stop trusting the entire experience. Pew's recent survey found that nearly half of Americans say most of the news they run into is not relevant to their own lives, while Gallup says trust in mass media has fallen to 28%. That is why so much modern news fails the real test. It does not answer the question that matters at the kitchen table in the car at the end of the workday, so what? Does this affect my bills, my job, my trip, my safety, my family, my plans for this week? If the answer is never clear, then the viewer is not being informed. The viewer is being used for attention. And once people feel that, they begin protecting themselves by tuning out. Not because the world stopped mattering, because the packaging stopped respecting their lives. And this is where the story changes. Because once you stop asking which headline is loudest, you can finally ask the only question that matters now: which stories this week are actually moving real life in America. The first story that actually matters this week is gasoline, because gasoline is where a foreign crisis stops looking foreign. It becomes a receipt, a commute, a delivery charge, a family doing math in a parking lot. Reuters/Ipsos found that 55% of Americans say rising gas prices are already hurting their household finances, and 87% expect prices to climb even more in the coming month. That is not abstract anxiety. That is economic pressure arriving in real time. It affects workers who drive, parents who budget week-to-week small businesses that move goods, and anyone whose monthly cushion was already thin before this latest shock. What should people watch now? Not just the number on the station sign, but whether oil stays elevated after the first panic passes. Reuters reports crude has surged more than 40%, as the Iran war drags on with U.S. crude around $98 a barrel and Brent near $112. Markets are treating oil as a leading indicator because when energy stays hot, the pain rarely ends at the pump. It moves into freight, groceries, airline tickets, deliveries, and the general cost of keeping normal life running. So the point is not merely that gas is expensive this week, it is that energy may be the first visible signal that something larger is starting to push through the entire economy. And if that signal holds, the next story gets even more personal, the cost of borrowing money itself. The second story that actually matters this week is not a shouting match on television, it is the price of money. Because when Americans hear that the Federal Reserve held rates steady, many assume nothing changed. But that is not how pressure works. Sometimes the danger is not a new hike. It is the growing realization that relief may stay farther away than people hoped. This week, the Fed kept its benchmark rate at 3.50% to 3.75%, said inflation remains somewhat elevated and signaled a path that still looks cautious rather than comforting. Reuters reported that officials kept their outlook to just one cut in 2026, even as inflation expectations moved higher. Why does that matter in real life this week? Because higher for longer rates do not live inside Fed statements. They live in mortgage payments, car loans, credit card balances, small business borrowing, and the quiet fear of households that already feel stretched. And this is where the story becomes impossible to ignore if energy prices keep running hot while borrowing costs stay heavy. Families get squeezed from both sides at once. The BLS reported that producer prices rose 0.7% in February after a 0.5% increase in January, a sign that price pressure underneath the economy is still not fully gone. Reuters also reported Powell saying tariffs are helping keep inflation elevated while the Fed watches energy prices closely. So the point this week is not to obsess over every decimal point. It is to watch whether expensive energy and stubborn inflation keep delaying relief. Because if that happens, the next thing Americans will feel is not a headline. It will be a harder payment. And the next story that matters this week may be the place where Washington dysfunction turns into airport lines, missed flights, and lost time. The third story that actually matters this week is air travel, because this is what Washington dysfunction looks like when it leaves Capitol Hill and shows up at the checkpoint. Reuters reports the DHS funding lapse is now in its 35th day. TSA absences are already elevated at major airports, and Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy warned delays could worsen over the spring break weekend. At JFK, absences were reported at 29%, Atlanta was at 32%, both Houston airports were above 30%. TSA officers are working without pay and are set to miss a second paycheck on March 27th. That is why this story matters more than a typical Washington fight. On the surface, it looks like another ugly Senate standoff over funding and immigration enforcement. But AP reports the Senate bill to fund Homeland Security failed again, with Democrats pushing to fund TSA separately while the broader DHS fight remains stuck. In other words, the political argument is happening in Washington, but the cost is being pushed onto travelers, families, airports, and workers trying to get through the week. So what should people watch now? Not the speeches, the lines, the absentee rates, whether more officers quit, whether airports start warning passengers to arrive even earlier. Because once a political stalemate begins stealing time, money, and predictability from ordinary people, it is no longer just a beltway story. And the next story that matters this week may be even bigger, whether war spending and military escalation are starting to reshape what Americans will pay for far from the battlefield. The fourth story that actually matters this week is war spending and military escalation, because this is the point where a foreign conflict can stop feeling like a headline and start becoming a domestic obligation. Reuters reports the Pentagon is seeking more than $200 billion in supplemental funding for the war with Iran, even as that request is already meeting resistance on Capitol Hill. At the same time, U.S. officials told Reuters that Washington is deploying thousands of additional Marines and sailors to the Middle East, adding to an already large American military presence in the region. Why does that matter to ordinary Americans this week? Because once a conflict gets bigger in troops, money, and duration, the effects rarely stay overseas. They can move into fuel prices, deficit pressure, market nerves, supply risk, and the broader feeling that another distant war is becoming another bill the country may be asked to carry. The signs to watch now are not just battlefield updates. Watch whether troop deployments keep growing, whether emergency funding gains traction in Congress, and whether energy and shipping markets keep acting like this crisis will last. If all of that starts moving at once, then the story is no longer just about what is happening over there. It is about what may soon be felt over here. And that is where this entire week's news changes meaning. This is the point where the relationship with news has to change. Because doomscrolling is not awareness. It is exposure without orientation. It is the feeling of being flooded by events without gaining any real grip on what those events mean. Pew found that 52% of Americans feel worn out by the amount of news, while Gallup found trust in mass media has fallen to 28%. That is what happens when people are asked to absorb everything and understand almost nothing. Useful awareness is different. Useful awareness does not ask you to track every argument, every viral clip, every dramatic chyron. It asks a simpler question: which stories are actually moving the ground beneath daily life? This week, that means watching the stories that can change the cost of driving, borrowing, traveling, or carrying another foreign crisis back into the U.S. economy. Gas prices, interest rate relief, airport disruption, the expanding cost of military escalation. Those are not just headlines. They are pressure points. And that is the difference between being buried in information and being equipped by it. One leaves people anxious and passive. The other gives them a way to sort noise from consequence. Relevance, not volume, is what changes people's lives. And once you see that clearly, the next question becomes bigger than this week's headlines. It becomes a statement about what news should have been doing all along. So here is the promise this channel has to make if it wants to deserve anyone's attention. We are not here to chase every siren. We are not here to turn your uncertainty into a habit. We are not here to confuse volume with value, because the public's relationship with news is already damaged. Most Americans still believe being informed matters, but many also feel overwhelmed, selective, and increasingly distrustful of the system, asking for their attention every hour. That means the job is no longer to throw more noise at people. The job is to identify what is actually moving beneath the surface. This week, that means tracking the pressure points that can change daily life in measurable ways. Gas prices that are already straining household budgets, borrowing costs that may stay painful longer, airport disruption tied to Washington dysfunction, and a widening Middle East conflict that could deepen military and economic pressure at home. So the standard has to be simple and unforgiving. Every major story should answer one question: so what? Who does this hit? How soon? What signs should people watch? And what does it really mean once the cameras move on? Because relevance, not volume, is what changes people's lives. And the future of news may belong to whoever remembers that before the audience gives up on the whole thing completely. So here's what actually matters this week. Americans are not turning away from the news because they want ignorance. They are turning away because too much of modern news demands emotional energy without giving practical clarity in return. But this week has already shown the difference between noise and consequence. Rising gas prices are hitting household budgets. The Fed is still signaling caution on inflation and rates. Airport delays are worsening as the DHS funding fight drags on. And a widening Middle East conflict is raising the prospect of deeper U.S. military and financial involvement. That is the real filter, not what is loudest. What is moving daily life, not what dominates a panel for 6 minutes. What changes fuel costs, borrowing costs, travel plans, and the country's sense of stability? The most important story this week may not be the one screaming the hardest. It may be the one quietly changing what Americans pay, how they move, and what they trust. The deeper lesson is simple. People do not need more alarms. They need a more honest map, a way to tell the difference between stories that consume attention and stories that actually shape life. That is what useful awareness does. It does not ask you to know everything. It asks you to watch the few things that change the ground under your feet. This week, those things are clear enough: energy pressure, expensive money, travel disruption, and the risk that a distant conflict becomes a domestic burden. When news helps people see that, clearly it becomes useful again. When it does not, it becomes another source of exhaustion. If you're watching this, comment your location and local time and tell me which of these 4 stories you think will hit Americans the hardest this week. And subscribe if you want coverage built on one rule above all others: less noise, more relevance.